Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Cogut Institute for the Humanities at Brown University and to our Spring 2022 Meet the Fellows event. I'm Amanda Anderson, the director of the Institute. It's my great pleasure to host this event, which will showcase the current research of our annual fellows through a series of speed talks. The fellows who will speak tonight are participants in the Cogut Institute Fellows Seminar. Every year, the seminar gathers a new group of around 20 fellows for weekly sessions at which they share and discuss their individual research projects and provide each other with feedback on work in progress. These fellows include faculty members, undergraduates, graduate students, and postdoctoral fellows, representing a wide array of disciplines across the humanities and the humanistic social sciences. The way in which the seminar brings together scholars from different disciplines and also different stages of career is one of the most generative and unusual aspects of our research community. It affords fellows the invaluable opportunity to interact with and learn from diverse scholarly perspectives. We hope this evening's event communicates the dynamism and vitality of the research sponsored this year by the Institute. A cutting-edge program such as the seminar would not be possible without the generous support of many. I am particularly grateful to the Mellon Foundation and individual donors who have helped us to create a permanent endowed fund for our Mellon postdoctoral fellows. And of course, I'm deeply grateful to Brown University for its continued support for the postdoctoral fellowships in international humanities and for the Cogut Institute as a whole. In addition to supporting a unique fellowship community, the Cogut Institute also serves as an intellectual commons at Brown through initiatives on topics in environmentalism, racial justice, the global humanities, and collaboration within and beyond the humanities disciplines. The courses, events, and opportunities offered by the Institute are intended to enrich conversations across the university and to create fruitful connections throughout academia and beyond. At the close of tonight's event, we will provide links to various website pages where you can explore our programs. Before we turn to this evening's talk, I want to thank, as always, the dedicated teamwork of the Cogut staff and Brown's Media Services Department, who are here behind the scenes, always aiming to ensure that we have a seamless experience. Here is how we will proceed this evening. I will introduce the fellows two at a time, and talks will be delivered in pairs. There are 10 talks. Each pairing features fellows at different stages of career, and we invite you to think about how their projects speak to each other, revealing shared methodologies and concerns, or shedding an intriguing light on each other's aims or findings. Our first speaker will be Emily Owens, the David and Michelle Ebersman Assistant Professor of History. Emily's teaching and research explore race, gender, and sexuality in US history, and she is the author of the forthcoming book, The Fantasy of Consent: Violence and Survival in Antebellum New Orleans. She's working on a new manuscript that situates the figure of the lesbian in the intellectual and cultural history of American feminism. She will be followed by Kaitlan, an undergraduate fellow concentrating in English literature, with interests in cross-cultural dialogue and history. Her work examines literary representations of the Vietnam War, considering how the imagination is used as an active tool to reclaim historical authority, particularly of displaced Vietnamese refugees. Please enjoy these first two talks.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Amanda, for that kind introduction and for hosting this event and for hosting me and my fellow colleagues this semester in the Cogut Humanities Seminar. I also want to thank Media Services and the staff of the Cogut Institute for making this experience seamless, and our experiences in general at the Cogut seamless and pleasurable. And finally, I want to thank my fellow panelists who I'm really looking forward to learning from tonight and as we move through the rest of the semester together. So for my speed talk, I'm going to talk about the work that I'm starting this semester as a Cogut Fellow. I'm beginning a work on a new book, which is tentatively titled Belated: Lesbians Out of Time. In short, this project is about lesbians and it's about time. It's a project that is interested in empirical questions about who lesbians have been over time, particularly with respect to their roles in American feminist cultures, movements, and academic traditions. But my curiosity is also about time itself and the way that ideas about time shape American feminist ideas about lesbians. So as a historian, I'm attuned to time, but as a feminist theorist, I'm attuned to time in a different kind of way. In other words, this book is about lesbians across time. So time is the place where stuff happens, but it's also about lesbians as a symbol or relic of time and how time has passed in American feminist culture. Belated, Lesbians Out of Time begins with a comic staple of women's studies and feminist culture, the ugly lesbian. The notion, and I hope that there's a lot of humor in this project, the notion that lesbians are a problem for feminist politics, as a menace to liberal feminisms, as an antagonist to trans feminisms, as an absence from women of color feminisms, or simply as a frumpy, ugly joke in mainstream US culture, that all can be traced, I think, to the late 19th century and all the way up into the present. In this project, then, I want to center lesbians as historical actors in feminist movements and as an idea that is circulated within and haunted feminist theory and practice, to register a serious question for women's studies and women's history and gender studies. I want to ask, why have the academic field of US women's studies, the theoretical productions of feminist theory, the organizing work of feminist activists, and the aesthetic traditions of feminist cultures so consistently imagined lesbians as a problem? I treat the figure of the lesbian as a historical artifact, observing how 20th century US feminists have consistently figured the lesbian as regressive, passé, and out of step with the goals of feminist and queer theory and organizing. In Belated, my hope is to unearth a 20th century history of lesbian political, intellectual, and aesthetic cultures, alongside the history of the figure or icon of the lesbian as an antagonist and often straw man of feminist, queer, and anti-racist left cultures and politics. My hope is that I can show how left political actors have distanced themselves from the figure of the lesbian through particular tropes, including whiteness, Zionism, racism, and transphobia, or have distanced themselves from those formations through the figure of the lesbian, all of which serve as a metonym for the ugliest elements of the history of the second wave. This works to locate lesbian culture and politics as bereft of analytic purchase, as an anachronistic relic of a feminist past that we are eager to forget. But this rush to forget, and this is sort of the conceit of my project, simplifies the historical reality of US feminist culture, politics, and theory. So in a way, Belated tries to offer a corrective to a flattened story about US feminisms, centering racially diverse lesbian feminist theorists and culture workers who, I argue, were central to the feminist renaissance of the mid-20th century, and whose work has laid the foundation for contemporary feminist, queer, and trans organizing and theory. So I'm interested in the lesbianism of Audre Lorde, Pat Parker, Barbara and Beverly Smith, and Tazaki Shange, Cheryl Clark, Alice Walker, lots of feminist theorists and poets who have been hailed largely as women of color and very infrequently hailed as lesbian feminist theorists. I'm interested in the lesbians who were central to the feminist press movement of the late 1970s and early 1980s. And in particular, I'm interested in the founding of Kitchen Table Press, South End Press, and Shameless Hussy Press. I'm interested in the racial politics of the so-called lesbian baby boom of the 1990s. And I'm interested in how all of this sits relative to the partial institutionalization of feminist and queer theory in universities since the 1970s, particularly in the context of the non-institutionalization of lesbian studies and Black women's studies. So those are kind of the sites that I care about. But I hope that overall, this project is going to open up a new history of American feminist thought, activism, and culture that will demonstrate the compatibility of anti-sexism and anti-racism in practice, and the continued urgency of centering misogyny as a tool for feminist analysis. So thanks for listening, and I look forward to a semester of conversation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kaitlan Bowie, and I'm a senior undergraduate studying English and East Asian studies, although not really. I find that these categories often fail to describe exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about my research. I say I'm studying English when what I really mean is literature, even art. And I say that I'm studying East Asian studies when what I really mean is Southeast Asian diasporic studies. In other words, I am academically situated in a state of in-betweenness. And this in-betweenness, this inability to name, this discomfort, all these things motivate and move my thesis. Over the past year, I have been studying post-war Vietnamese diasporic memory making through storytelling. That is a huge jumble of words that basically boils down to how does storytelling, the act of telling stories to others and to ourselves, how does that allow us to reimagine the history we often fail to understand, or the history we never can completely understand? Unlike history and literature, storytelling and imagining make things personal. They're intimate. So how do they allow us to cope with, to claim, and to create memories, even memories that are not ours to begin with? And here, of course, I'm talking about personal accounts of Vietnamese history after the war that ended in 1975. These accounts are laced with loss and trauma, memories hidden but also recycled over and over, like jagged stones that are softened by river currents over time. In my work, I am drawn to the processes of memory making, even more than the memories themselves, and especially to what Marianne Hirsch calls post-memory, which is, quote, the relationship that the generation after bears to the personal, collective, and cultural trauma of those who came before. If we're using the rock as a metaphor for memory, then I'm interested in what happens to the rock, the memory, when someone picks it up. That person can never truly see the jaggedness of the rock before, no matter how the rock tells its story. And even as this person stands in the cold water gripping this rock, they are not experiencing the same river the rock lived through, because now the water is different. The only thing this person can do to understand the personal history of this rock is to imagine, even if they know that their imaginings are not quite real. But humans are not rocks, and they create things in order to share the memories, the stories, and the imaginations they have, and also to relate themselves to their personal histories. In my research, I look at comics, books, articles, interviews, art, as mediums of memory making for post-war diasporic Vietnamese individuals. It's a fancy term to reference people like myself. I am part of what Marianne Hirsch would call the post-memory generation. I and my cousins and friends did not experience what Americans call the Vietnam War and what the Vietnamese called the American War. We only imagine it. But we imagine it over and over, and oftentimes we imagine it wrongly. We even know we're imagining it wrongly, but we can't help it. They're so colorful, so real, we can almost touch them. I call these imaginations imagined memories, used to cope with the anxiety and ethics of inheriting a past that is not and will never be really ours. My post-generation inhabits the present and the past in the same way I inhabit the fields of English and East Asian studies, with an in-betweenness, an inability to name, and year upon years of unspoken discomfort. So in my work, not only do I seek to understand Vietnamese diasporic storytelling and the ways its evolutions affect personal identity and a kind of reclamation power, I also celebrate the non-knowing that comes with creativity and conversation. And we must undertake these processes of discovery because, as Bell Hooks writes, we're still there differently than those before us, but there, otherwise known as here. As humans and not rocks, our timelines talk to each other, as do our histories and our memories. We are not bound by the past, by war, or by a certain prescribed history. In fact, we reclaim those spaces when we share ourselves with each other, especially by way of storytelling. Storytelling makes my imagination your imagination. You allow me into your in-betweenness, and I allow you into mine. When I interviewed one of my cousins in his house, the same house my grandparents once lived in, he said, "We kind of made it our own kind of space." Thank you to the Cogut Institute and my colleagues here, and especially to those who cultivated space for me so that I could grow up to make my own. Thank you to my parents and aunts and uncles and cousins and friends who are most probably watching. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaitlan, and thank you, Emily, for those compelling and important and moving projects that engage in acts of historical re-examination and reclamation. Next up are two fellows whose work explores early cultures. First, we have Mariah Min, a postdoctoral fellow in international humanities in the Department of English, the program in medieval studies, and the Cogut Institute. Her work reframes medieval literary character as a tactic deployed by the text rather than an unmediated depiction of psychology, bringing her analyses into conversation with contemporary debates in literary studies. Our next speaker, Baoli Yang, is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Comparative Literature, where she focuses on medieval Sinoscript literature and its modern repercussions. Her research explores the interrelation of imaginary borders and frontiers in works mainly written in Middle Chinese and in the context of Afro-Eurasian transcontinental connectivity. We'll turn now to Mariah.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Mariah Min, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow affiliated with the Cogut, the Department of English, and the program in medieval studies. My research and teaching center around the literary output of Britain and interlinked cultural regions from about the 9th century to the 15th. The conversations that I'm currently having with this archive have to do with the concept of literary character, in specific with the question, what goes into the making of a character? And further, what goes into the making of certain figures of the human in contemporary sociopolitical discourse? Throughout the history of character as a literary critical concept, it has persistently been associated with human psychology. Scholars have credited Shakespeare for inventing modernity by portraying characters with psychological depth. Scholars have pronounced that character does not exist because human beings don't possess coherent psychologies to begin with. My work intervenes to shake loose this sedimented association by drawing attention to medieval characters who are uniquely situated to highlight how literary character is a constructed object that performs the work of the text alongside its other formal elements. This is because medieval literature is heavily genre conscious in that it answers to the conventions of the forms among which it is positioned rather than to the demands of mimetic realism. Accordingly, its depictions of character are more likely to display conspicuous traces of how each has been put together. This mediated quality of character is not solely a medieval trait. Even realist portrayals of human psychology are portrayals that come to us through intervening literary layers. Characters are, after all, distinct from human beings, just as literature is distinct from life itself. On the other hand, characters do have consequences for human beings. Characterization not only reflects, but molds ideology, creating versions of people that function for readers as practice for real-world encounters. The ethical dimension of character studies then asks us to notice how the figure of the human is used to shape the ways we relate to one another. Here is a parting example to leave you with to illustrate how contemporary issues can intersect with the lessons of medieval character. In the liberal rhetoric defining the United States as a nation of immigrants, the character of an American is defined as an immigrant. But this rhetoric excludes Indigenous and many Black Americans whose mode of presence in the country does not result from immigration, but rather illustrates how dispossession and enslavement relocate bodies. The character of an American as an immigrant turns away from the examination of power structures that underlie the American national project, placing value instead on the promise of social mobility and harmonious coexistence. Using medieval character as a lens through which to read such moments provides the language to describe them, drawing connections among discrete situations to imbue them with more than epiphenomenal status. Medieval character helps sharpen our eyes to see what we are looking at. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Professor Anderson, for having me, and I appreciate the efforts of the staff who helped put this event together. I am Baoli Yang, a PhD candidate in Brown's Comparative Literature Department. I would like to share with you part of my dissertation project. The focus of my dissertation is the conceptualization of border and frontier in Sinoscript literature, by which I mean the works written in the Chinese writing system related to the Chinese cultural legacy at the peak of medieval Chinese imperialism. The project I presented in the Cogut seminar was entitled Poetic Violence and Masculine Imperialism in Medieval China. During the first half of the 8th century, Emperor Xuanzong of the Tang Dynasty expanded the scope of his political dominance and cultural influence, his reign being known afterwards as the High Tang, meaning the pinnacle of the dynasty. The influx of foreigners, exchange of exotic goods, and the importation of foreign ways of thought all contributed to the multicultural splendor of the High Tang. Gradual exposure to external influences accompanied nuanced articulation of differences and innovations in Tang literature. However, the devastating Anlushan rebellion, initiated by foreign generals in the Tang army, put an end to these good times and frustrated the Tang's receptive attitude towards the foreign from the mid-8th century. For the remainder of the dynasty, cultural elites focused their attention on remembering and reconstructing the glory of the past. My project deals with the symbolism of youth, poetics of violence, and the imperialist masculinity. The poets of the High Tang repurposed the traditional knight-errant trope and dramatized the violence in imperial warfare to portray a vision of manhood that the authors themselves did not possess. The model warriors mixed the identity of traditional Chinese images with the action of contemporaneous foreign warriors. I argue that the abundant imagery of youth and violence in High Tang poetry portrayed an imperialist masculinity, which evinced the cultural segregation between Chinese literary elites and the foreign generals in the Tang army. This combination of Chinese and foreign ethnic particularities enabled the construction of an ideal Chinese manhood, which fails to acknowledge the achievements of foreign generals. Drawing on Homi Bhabha and Bradley Dean for theoretical inspiration, I reject the prevailing view that takes the poetic notion of High Tang for granted without examining its social and historical context. I also break new ground by discussing the repercussions of imperial masculinity from a literary perspective in medieval China. Becoming a Cogut Fellow this year has offered me a wonderful opportunity to carry out this project. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mariah and Baoli. I'm really looking forward to seeing your striking and ambitious, in the best sense, projects continue to unfold. We now feature two scholars exploring English language novels. Tim Bewes is professor of English and an affiliate faculty member in modern culture and media. Most broadly, his work has explored the relation between aesthetics and politics within a Marxist theoretical frame. He's the author of several books, including the forthcoming title, Free Indirect, The Thought of 21st Century Fiction. His current work examines the notion of fictionality, its uses and its limits. And then we have Christina Gilligan, a doctoral candidate in the Department of English. Her work explores readerly identification as a key site of anxiety and experimentation for novelists of 19th century Britain. We'll turn to Tim Bewes first.
Thanks so much, Amanda, and good evening to all those attending. My name is Tim Bewes. I'm a professor of English here at Brown, and really pleased to be in residence at the Cogut Institute for the Humanities this spring 2022. In the last few years, I've been working on a subfield of literary studies known as the theory of the novel, a field that is around 100 years old, depending on how you conceptualize both the novel and its theorization. The founder of the field is generally taken to be the Marxist thinker Georg Lukács, who in 1914 to 15 wrote the first work to be called The Theory of the Novel. There have been several other books with that title since. But there's a particular strain in Lukács' thinking about the novel that has a special interest for me, and a special relevance, I argue, for our times. That strain has to do with the failure of his theoretical project when it comes to explaining what the novel is and what the novel does. Almost every other theorist of the novel begins with the scholarly instinct to explain, to understand, to theorize. The theorist proposes to explain what this thing, the novel, is, what it is really saying, underneath what it seems to be saying, what it is doing, why it emerges historically when it does, what work, ideological, ethical, constitutive, it performs. And in a similar way, literary critics approach the novel in order to tell you what this novel that you are reading means. These presuppositions are fine when it comes to other disciplines, other literary forms, other discursive and scholarly endeavors. But Lukács' insight is that such interpretive approaches do not work when it comes to the novel, for the simple reason that what you encounter when you read a novel are nothing but isolated subjectivities, each of which makes utterances that have no assurance whatsoever of connecting to really existing relations or the world of ethical necessity, for their factual basis cannot extend beyond the psychological realm. Underlying the novel is what he calls a dissonance of unspoken and unspeakable meaning, a dissonance that itself speaks of something quite devastating to contemplate, a fragility to the world and to our attempts to make sense of it. In such formulations, what Lukács is proposing is that the novel never achieves any kind of signifying closure. What the novel reveals is something far more disturbing, the futility of human aspirations, the absurdity of existence, and in perhaps the most devastating formulation in the book, quote, the possibility of the ultimate nothingness of man, unquote. When the novel does attain closure, the result is invariably unsatisfactory, mere entertainment, consolation, what Lukács would later in his Marxist phase call ideology. By avoiding such closure, the novel remains faithful to its essence as a form for an age where all truths are suspect by definition, where the only insights possible are fleeting, local, and evanescent. The novel, says Lukács, is a form for a world abandoned by God. These pessimistic formulations have become famous, even notorious, in Lukács studies. But the field of novel theory that Lukács founded has mostly turned away from them. One looks in vain for the work of later theorists for any attempt to grapple with their meaning or their implications. Generally speaking, the field of novel theory has been constructed on the basis of a series of terms that, on the contrary, try to bridge the ontological and rhetorical abyss that was revealed in Lukács' early work. Terms such as realism, according to which the novel, quote, embodies in microcosm the dialectics of the historical moment, unquote. Or ethics, by which the novelist, quote, strives to represent the other in her own terms as a speaking subject, unquote. Or finally, irony, in which everything in the novel is seen as many-sided, unquote. I'm quoting three different, more contemporary critics there. My own work on the novel returns to and takes seriously Lukács' insights about the novel in the light of certain developments in the contemporary novel that seem to bear out his ideas. But the particular emphasis of my current project, the project I will be working on during my time at the Cogut Institute, is in trying to develop a critical and scholarly register appropriate to that fundamental insight of Lukács's theory of the novel, that the thought of the novel escapes all critical methods that set out to understand the novel as a form, or that try to bridge the gap using one theoretical term or another. In other words, I'm setting out to develop a critical register on the novel that responds to the inaccessibility of its thought to theoretical discourse. Thanks so much for being here and for listening. I'm looking forward to the conversation going forward.
Hi, everyone. My name is Christina Gilligan, and I'm a PhD candidate in the English department. I want to begin by again thanking Amanda and everyone at the Cogut for putting on this event and also for hosting me as a fellow. As a Cogut fellow, I'm continuing my work on my dissertation titled Readerly Identification in the Realist Novel from Austen to Hardy. What I find so exciting about the group of 19th century British novelists on whom I focus, specifically Jane Austen, Charlotte Bronte, George Eliot, and Thomas Hardy, is that they grapple seriously with the social, political, and ethical issues of this moment of great change, not only within their individual novels, but also across their novelistic careers. That is, they continue to revisit and revise both their commitments and the ways in which these commitments are bodied forth in their work. My project in particular analyzes the ways in which identification is invited or resisted by the formal features, narration, character, plotting of these novels, and how that identification or lack thereof is then put to work in furtherance of the novelist's critical project or projects. So what is identification and how does it differ from something like sympathy? Identification involves a sustained blurring of the boundary between reader and a character or perhaps a narrator. Identification differs from sympathy both in its absorptiveness and its durationality. So for instance, in speaking of sympathy, we might say we felt for such and such character in a specific scene or at a specific moment. However, in speaking of identification, we make no such qualification. We say, to take a contemporary example, that we are a Carrie or a Miranda. In past critical work, identification has been, on the one hand, derided as the activity of the amateur reader. The professional reader must always maintain the kind of critical distance that identification obliterates. And on the other hand, praise is a site of particularly feminist readerly pleasure. Notably, both of these critical positions treat identification as fully within the purview of the reader. The text is imagined to play little or no role. Yet novels themselves invite readers to identify in all sorts of ways, from first-person narration to an emphasis of the universal or general experience over specificity. Indeed, while some works, like to return to our earlier example of Sex and the City, or in my own work, Middlemarch, leave the identificatory field quite open, that is, one could plausibly be a Carrie or a Charlotte, a Dorothea Brooke or a Mary Garth, others do not. For instance, we might think of the near imperative to identify with Jane and Jane Eyre on the one hand, and on the other, the near impossibility of entering into a sustained identificatory relationship with any character in Thomas Hardy's The Woodlanders, where the characters court not our identification, but our ambivalence. As we can hear from even these short examples, identification in the Victorian novel is taken up quite differently from novel to novel, and even within the same novelist's body of work. What my project is interested in then is not only the extent to which the projects of the 19th century British novels are bodied forth through readerly identification, but also the risks and opportunities of reliance on identificatory strategies. What kind of socio-political and ethical projects are made possible by identification and which are barred by them? Are there more and less ethical ways to invite identification? And what is the cost in ethical, political, and aesthetic terms of the insistence on similarity over difference, which identification so often involves? My hope for the project is that the answers to these questions in the context of the 19th century novel will inform our understanding of what is at stake in contemporary debates over identity politics, representation, and social change. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim and Christina, for these fascinating and especially timely, I think, literary projects. Now we turn to two projects focusing on Indigenous peoples of the Americas. Yara Doumani is an undergraduate double concentrating in history and environmental studies. Her project investigates the emergence of Indigenous women's activism in the late 1970s. She explores how the group Women of All Red Nations and affiliated sovereignty movements spearheaded the fight for water and life, resisting the intersecting violences of settler colonialism, cis-heteropatriarchy, and capitalist extraction. Andrew Scherer is Associate Professor of Anthropology and Archaeology. He is an anthropologist, archaeologist, and biological anthropologist with a geographic focus in Mesoamerica. His current work explores war and violence among the ancient Maya. Yara?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction. As was mentioned, my name is Yara Doumani. I am a senior studying history and environmental studies with a focus in settler colonial studies here at Brown on occupied Narragansett lands. While at the Cogut, I'm working on my undergraduate history honors thesis titled In Sisterhood, I Will Remain Strong, Intertribal and Transnational Indigenous Women's Activisms and Representations. My project investigates Indigenous women's organizing in the late 1970s to the mid-1980s, which, as was mentioned, spearheaded the fight for sovereignty, liberation, and life, and against the intersecting violences of settler colonialism, cis-heteropatriarchy, and capitalist extraction in what is known as the US. This comes at a time when post-World War II anti-colonial nationalist movements, hegemonic carceral feminisms in the second wave, and the American Indian movement's radical sovereignty work and occupations in the post-termination era failed to adequately address the needs of Native women, youth, queer peoples, and future generations yet to come. Utilizing the Native and feminist presses, zines, and other public-facing ephemera, personal correspondences, oral histories, health and ecological studies, as well as legal records, I explore the women and discursive ecologies of these movements and interrogate how these assertions of a uniquely liberatory political imagination have remained central to demands for just futures in the present decolonial moment. So generally, scholars tend to fixate on what is commonly considered the start and supposed end of the Red Power movement by following the American Indian movement's trajectory from the occupation of Alcatraz in 1969, of the Pine Ridge Reservation at Wounded Knee in 1973, and the completion of the Longest Walk in 1978. But by focusing on the years following 1978, a time in the wake of violent state-led counterinsurgency efforts to dismantle such radicalism, I examine how Native women built power and strengthened communities in ways that both diverged from and furthered the afterlives of Red Power. Such work took the form of education and mutual aid, militant sacred lands protection and treaty rights work, fighting to free Native women political prisoners, health and environmental justice efforts, and beyond. Instead of providing a synopsis of my entire thesis, I'm going to briefly speak about the final chapter and highlight some of the women within it. This section explores the untold histories of the movement to keep alive and free 3 incarcerated Native women: Lakota woman Rita Silknani, Paiute woman Angie White Rock, and lesbian Cherokee woman Raven Darkwing. Grounded in my archival research in the Brown University Special Collections as a Hay undergraduate fellow, I analyzed these women's activist life writing in the form of poetry, personal letters, and public statements as they assert their right to defend themselves and their children from racist, colonial, sexist, and homophobic violence. I traced their cases through the lesbian feminist anti-prison news journal No More Cages, which worked to subvert the colonial and carceral violence of removal and isolation by connecting women on the inside with each other and with friends, family, and anti-prison activists on the outside, both locally and across the globe. So through a reading of these 3 women's life histories, their original analyses and nuanced conceptualizations of justice, I look into how Native women on the inside and outside were theorizing and practicing Indigenous sisterhood, which is a term that came from within these texts that encapsulates intimate relationships and the building of an imagined community of women who often never met by forging and maintaining personal connections as survival and political practice. So Native and Indigenous studies, Black feminist critique, as well as a belief in the power of friendship and love frame my thesis. and my positionality as simultaneously a settler on Turtle Island and a queer Palestinian woman grappling with the Israeli settler colonial occupation and transnational solidarity with Indigenous peoples also continuously informs this project and my time learning alongside peers at the Cogut. So thank you so much for engaging with me on this, and I look forward to listening to the next presenters share their amazing work.
Hello, I'm Andrew Scherer, and I'm a faculty member in the Department of Anthropology. My thanks to Amanda and the Cogut staff for organizing this wonderful event and providing me with a platform to talk about my current research project. I'm an anthropological archaeologist and biological anthropologist whose research focuses on the pre-colonial Maya of Mexico and Central America. I co-direct with Charles Golden of Brandeis University an active archaeological field project along the Usumacinta River that forms the modern border between Chiapas, Mexico, and Petén, Guatemala, and we work in both countries. My laboratory research is largely oriented towards bioarchaeology, the study of human remains in archaeological contexts. In terms of field work, we conduct comparative research on 3 classic Maya kingdoms, Piedras Negras, Yaxchilan, and Tzatzi, which means white dog in classic Mayan. These kingdoms date to roughly AD 350 to 800, and the broader goal of our investigations is to understand how these 3 indigenous kingdoms thrived for roughly 4 centuries, only to be largely abandoned in the 9th century. The focus of my fellowship project at the Cogut relates to the practice of violence among the pre-colonial Maya. The genesis of this project was twofold. In part, it stems from 2 decades of field survey that my colleagues and I have conducted in the jungles of Mexico and Guatemala, where we have systematically documented the defensive fortifications of the 3 kingdoms I mentioned. My bioarchaeological research also informs this project. Over the years, I've documented numerous cases of interpersonal violence, some of which likely stem from warfare and others from ritual contexts that are typically glossed as sacrifice. While my book project is in part a synthesis of the evidence of war and other forms of violence among the Maya, it more broadly grapples with the moral frameworks within which the violence was conducted. Morality is not a topic that archaeologists normally engage, in part because it is difficult to reconstruct in the deep past, as it is a nebulous subject in the present. However, ignoring the question of morality has led to problematic characterizations of violence in past societies. Thus, a basic challenge undergirds my work: how to appropriately present the evidence for violence in the past without further fueling distorted understandings of past societies like the pre-colonial Maya. Critical to this project is understanding how Maya interbeing relations, and especially obligations to their gods and ancestors, shaped the conduct of violence. It was godly sacrifice that created the sun and brought about the orderliness of the mundane world that humans inhabit, forever binding humans and gods by what ethnographer John Monahan frames as a covenant, one of mutual sustenance. There is an ontological dimension to pre-colonial Maya violence, in that violence was fundamentally associated with others, animals, gods, and foreigners. In a sense, violence made one non-human. Thus, Maya warriors adopted the guise of animals when they went to war, a practice seen as analogous to the hunt, that is, animals hunting other animals. And when it came to the administration of justice through violence, Maya lords and ladies became gods in what is often characterized as impersonation, but is better understood by what my colleague Stephen Houston calls co-occurrence, donning masks and other regalia to embody these other side timeless beings in the mundane world of the presence. This is referenced in the working title of my book, By the Hand of God, Violence and the Morality of Killing in Ancient Maya Society. The title acknowledges that on the eve of the conquest, the Maya recognized that killing was done at the behest of the gods. For example, the Great Motul Dictionary of Yucatec Maya, a 16th century document that's housed here at the John Carter Brown Library, names the knives to kill others as ukab ku, the hand or arm of God. Equally, among the conquest era Quiche Maya of the Guatemalan highlands, their knives were named ukab tohil, the hand or arm of Tohil, their patron deity whose very name is synonymous with justice and vengeance. While calling attention to practices such as godly co-occurrence or going to war as animals risks further exoticizing the pre-colonial Maya, my goal in this work is to show that these practices, for better or for worse, can be found across human societies. Because of the fundamental inhumanity of killing, agents of death often share or disperse the culpability of that violence onto beings other than themselves, just as they actively dehumanize the victims of violence. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Andrew and Yara, for those powerful talks. For our final pairing of the evening, we have 2 scholars exploring projects that speak to the urgencies of our time, as many of the talks have, and draw out forms of experience that have been insufficiently acknowledged or apprehended. Emily Lim Rogers is a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in the Department of American Studies, the program in Science, Technology, and Society, and the Cogut Institute. She teaches courses at the intersection of disability studies, science, technology, and society, the medical humanities, and gender and sexuality studies, and the history of capitalism. Her research considers the incomplete medicalization of chronic fatigue syndrome, also known as myalgic encephalomyelitis, or MECFS. Connor Jenkins is an undergraduate fellow studying history and Africana studies, focusing on slavery's afterlives in his home state of North Carolina. His work explores regional remembering and misremembering of slavery. We'll turn first to Emily.
Thank you, Amanda, and thanks to Trouda and the Cogut staff and the media team here for making this event happen. I'm really excited to be here. I'm Emily Lim Rogers. I am the Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow in Disability Studies at Cogut and the Departments of American Studies and the program in Science, Technology, and Society. I'm an interdisciplinary anthropologist and historian who works at the intersection of disability studies, STS, and American studies. Broadly, I'm interested in what happens when forms of debility emerge in ways that strain Western biomedicine's current paradigms for understanding bodies and treating disease. I'm also interested in the inverse, how these emergent forms of chronic illness and disability are pushing against the internal consistency of Western biomedicine itself. While at Cogut, I'm writing a number of articles based off of my dissertation research, which is entitled Clinical Proximities, Chronic Fatigue Syndrome and Biomedicine's Binds. In it, I look at the politics of chronic fatigue syndrome, and also known as myalgic encephalomyelitis, or MECFS, and there's a lot of politics to naming as well. But rather than ask, is it real or not, I consider this contested terrain as a rich window into the fraught workings of American biomedicine, including its imbrications with a for-profit healthcare system, gutted social safety net, arrangements of capitalism, and gendered and racialized divisions of labor. MECFS has its own particular history, and the contemporary ramifications are lived out in specific ways by the patients who live with it. The history of how American culture has understood fatigue, the hallmark but by no means only symptom of MECFS, is shot through with understandings of the laboring body. And second, MECFS is profoundly and sort of disproportionately debilitating, yet receives very little attention. For instance, it is the least funded by the NIH per disease burden of any entity in the US. People with MECFS struggle to get on disability, yet they have no treatments, and most of them are unemployed, yet with little, if any, financial support from the state. All of these I talk about in the dissertation through an archival excavation of fatigue and through 4 years of immersive ethnographic research with an MECFS patient activist group. So the dissertation certainly explores the specificities of MECFS and aims to place it in its particular material context. But since beginning this project in 2016, I've always seen MECFS as an opportunity to scale up, to examine how American biomedicine works when gendered contested illnesses emerge. But all of this has been made, as Amanda alluded to, all the more urgent in the aftermath of COVID-19. As long COVID emerges, MECFS is a means into, for example, why we know so little about post-viral illness. The decades of dismissal MECFS has faced is an important lesson into the tensions that happen when debility exists without medical explanation. It has also been inspiring to see a nascent coalition building between long COVID groups and MECFS activists, despite the fact that there are actually a lot of underlying frustrations that people with MECFS have lived with this for decades without the sort of interest that long COVID has suddenly been met with. Okay, so speaking of coalition building, during my time at Cogut, one of the articles I'll produce is called Viral Entanglements. This paper zeroes in on coalitions between lesbians with MECFS and AIDS activists in the 1980s. I ask how it came to pass that, for a brief moment at least, MECFS was understood as a lesbian health, yet how the elusive concept of lesbian health proved not enough for the disease to gain a constituency and become a public health emergency in the way that AIDS was, and that long COVID may actually become. So I'm thrilled to be able to further explore the many different balances of this project with the support of Cogut, and I'm so excited to be in conversation with you all this semester. Thanks for tuning in.
Hi, everyone. My name is Connor Jenkins, and while I start to share my screen, I do want to express really quickly my gratitude to Amanda Anderson, to the Cogut Fellows and staff, and especially my advisor, Francoise Hamlin, without whose support this project would simply not be possible. So a capital in colonial North Carolina and a crucial hub for trade into the 19th century, Edenton, North Carolina was the hometown of numerous early North Carolina politicians, including many signatories of the Declaration of Independence. As a colonial capital, it sustained early connections to the nation-building project that married racial slavery to settler colonialism. In this project, I'm examining the spatial and gendered implications of slavery on memory in Edenton as instructive for regional differences in slavery and its afterlives in the United States. Representative of Edenton's contradictions are two of many of its incredibly famous residents. So first is Harriet Jacobs, and she was the author of the canonical 1861 Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And she was born and enslaved in Edenton before her famous flight, in which she hid in her grandmother's attic for 7 years before heading north 7 years later. This is an image of the famous runaway ad after she escaped to the north, and the man who enslaved her pretty vigorously followed her to the north to try to recapture her. The next individual is James Cathcart Johnston, who was the son of a wealthy enslaver who had served as both a United States senator and a North Carolina governor. And he lived in Edenton from his birth in the 1780s until he died in 1865 at the age of 82. By 1860, he enslaved at least 555 Black people across his eastern North Carolina plantations, making him amongst the wealthiest enslavers in North Carolina and in the entire Upper South. So a central logic of racial slavery that's really central to my project is something that Stephanie Camp articulates through the bondage of space and time, which is something that describes the spatial distribution of enslaved people's bodies and labors. I'm using this lens to examine the power of gender and space in Edenton, applying this analytic to a local scale. Contesting the myth of slavery in the Upper South as lenient, I am examining this gendered experience across Edenton and Northeastern North Carolina generally, and I'm discovering an important caveat, which is that the opportunities for escape and fugitivity from slavery were substantially different in Edenton when you compare it to the Mississippi Valley, particularly through enslaved people's knowledge of nearby waterways and maroon communities in the Great Dismal Swamp. So this regional difference is not reflective of any investment by white enslavers in the Edenton area in Black freedom. Rather, it reflects the material difference in the landscape in the Upper South and the ways in which enslaved people drew upon these geographies. So a nearby Civil War contraband camp was a site of refuge for many fugitive enslaved people in North Carolina who would flee eastward during the Civil War, to the region which was Union occupied. And when Confederate forces recaptured this fort in 1864, they indiscriminately murdered Black soldiers and civilians. Still today, the town valorizes the Confederate soldiers, as you can see with this monument here with the inscription reproduced below. Spatial discipline as a fundamental tenet of racial slavery and the devaluation of Black life informs local memory of slavery and the bloody crucible through which it ended in the Civil War. Descendants of many of these enslavers still occupy the plantations on which Black people labored, inviting tourists into their homes for holiday tours to view the architecture, while erasing the violence of racial slavery that physically built these homes and sustained their occupants for centuries. So the investment of tax dollars from a majority Black town today into preserving the homes of enslavers distills the potency, I think, of the misremembering of slavery and its impact on small towns in the Upper South. So I want to end with a juxtaposition that I think demonstrates pretty well the stakes of the racialization of memory as it is so starkly happening in the Upper South and the South at large. On this slide are some images of Hayes Plantation today, which is the plantation that James Cathcart Johnston owned. And as of 2 months ago, actually, the North Carolina General Assembly has decided to appropriate $6 million to purchase the land and the house from the descendants of the beneficiaries of the enslaved labor. And then on the other hand, this right here is the site at which Harriet Jacobs hid in an attic of her grandmother's house for 7 years, insisting upon freedom for herself and a better life for her children, even as she didn't even have the space to stand upright. The house is since gone, but yet there is no recognition of her courageous demands to life in the wake of its violent negation. In this moment today, we are doomed to fail to dismantle the legacies of slavery if we, particularly white Americans, are unable to interrogate our own intimate family and small town histories. Thank you to everyone for presenting your incredible talks, and thank you all for your support.
I know I speak for all of the audience members here when I say that those 2 talks and all the talks this evening were truly inspiring in reminding us of the incredible work being done across the humanities at the present time. Thanks so much to all of you for the energy and commitment you brought to this event and bring to your work. And thanks also to all the other fellows in the seminar who presented their work in the fall on our Fall Meet the Fellows. Thanks to these other fellows who've contributed so much to conversations that helped shape the projects that you just heard about. I hope this evening's event gives you a sense of the extraordinary research and thinking emerging from the seminar, and I think we can all eagerly anticipate the ongoing work of these scholars. As soon as the videos of the presentations from the event have been processed, we will upload them to the Cogut Institute YouTube channel, where you can also find videos from last semester's Meet the Fellows event as well. Coming up next at the Cogut Institute, on Monday, February 14th, we have the latest installment of the Humanities in the World series. Emily Greenwood, a classics scholar from Princeton University, will give a talk titled Verso Poetics, the Left Hand of Tradition in Dion Brand's The Blue Clerk, which will be a fascinating convergence of post-colonial theory, classics, and contemporary literary studies. And on Friday, February 18, we will be joined by Wendy Chun, a new media scholar at Simon Fraser University, who runs the Digital Democracies Institute there. Wendy and I will be in conversation about her new book, Discriminating Data, which uses a humanities lens for exploring the problems built into big data and machine learning. This event is a part of our series, Democracy, a Humanities Perspective. Both of these events will be on Zoom. You can find details of these events and more on our website. Some links are being shared in the chat right now, and you can sign up for our mailing list to stay up to date. We're planning a number of in-person events for later in the semester, and we really look forward to resuming in-person programming. I also encourage all Brown University students and faculty to explore our various funding opportunities, course offerings, and programs. And just thank you so much to everyone who joined us this evening. It really means a lot to have these fellows be able to present and share their work. We hope to see you again soon at our upcoming spring events. Thank you and good night to everybody.